The alarm did not wait for permission to scream. I was 3 sips into my evening ration when the proximity field on threshold 9 lit up red, and every screen on my console started shouting numbers I did not want to read. A ship had entered the station's restricted approach lane. No request. No transponder handshake. No clearance code. Just a single vessel, sliding through space that had not been open to traffic in 11 years, as if the lane belonged to it and always had. My hands were already moving before my mind caught up, because that is what years of training does to a body. I pulled the visual feed, expecting to see a smuggler, or worse, something from beyond the dead systems we no longer patrolled. Instead, I saw a shape I recognized instantly. Sharp lines, gray hull, a small flag etched near the bow that I had only ever seen in training files. A human ship. I want to be honest with you, because this story only makes sense if I am. My name is Vethric Solane, and I have spent 19 years working border control for the Compact, the alliance of species that keeps most of this galaxy from tearing itself apart over territory, resources, and old grudges. In that time, I have denied entry to ambassadors. I have turned away wealthy traders. I have once held an entire war fleet at the boundary line for 6 hours because their paperwork was incomplete by a single stamp. There is exactly one species I have never been allowed to stop: humans. It is written into the deepest layer of compact law, the kind of law that cannot be changed by a vote or a committee or even a war. Any human vessel, carrying any human crew, may cross any border, enter any restricted zone, and bypass any checkpoint without seeking authorization first. No other species in the galaxy has this right. Not the Drevex, who built half our orbital infrastructure. Not the Asuran Choir, who hold 3 seats on the Compact Council. Not even the Compact's own internal fleets, who still have to file a flight plan to cross from one sector to another. Only humans. For most of my career, I treated this rule the way you treat a strange birthmark on someone you barely know. It is there. It is a little odd, and you do not ask about it because the answer is probably uncomfortable for everyone involved. I assumed it was some ancient diplomatic favor, a debt repaid generations ago, the kind of thing nobody questions because questioning it would mean reopening a wound. I was wrong. It is not a favor. It is not even close. That night, watching the human ship glide past my station without so much as a courtesy ping, I made the mistake every new officer makes once. I tried to do my job. I opened a channel. Unidentified vessel. This is Threshold 9 Border Control. You are entering restricted space without clearance. Please respond and provide your authorization code. Silence. Not hostile silence. Not the silence of a ship ignoring me out of arrogance. It was the silence of a ship that had already calculated, in less time than it took me to finish my sentence, that my message did not require a reply, because nothing I said could change what was about to happen. I checked the registry out of habit, more to satisfy my own nerves than because I expected an answer. The ship was called the Halloway. Crew complement, 6. Class, light response cruiser. Then, beneath all of that, in a section of the database I had never had reason to open before, a single line of text that made my stomach turn cold. Clearance status, permanent override, all sectors, no exceptions. I had read about this line in training. I had never seen it triggered. I sat there, fingers hovering over controls that suddenly meant nothing, and watched a single small ship continue past every safeguard my station existed to enforce. My supervisor, an older Drevex named Holland Maitar, must have felt the alert ripple through the system, because her voice came over my comm before I could even decide what to report. "Solane, stand down on the intercept." "Supervisor, there is an unauthorized vessel in the restricted lane. I have not."
"I know what is in the restricted lane," she said. And there was something in her voice I had never heard from her before. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to recognition, the way you sound when an old injury starts aching before a storm.
"Let it through. Log the entry. Do not attempt contact again. Supervisor, with respect, my entire function here is to prevent exactly this kind of breach. If I let this go unchallenged, every other species in this sector will demand the same exemption, and we will lose control of the lane entirely." There was a pause. I could hear her exhale slowly on the other end, the way you do when you are about to explain something you have explained too many times before. to too many young officers who all asked the same question. "Vethric," she said, using my given name for the first time in the 2 years I had worked under her. "Do you know why that ship does not need our permission?" I assumed it was a treaty obligation, an old debt. "It is not a debt," she said. "It is a warning. One we wrote into our own laws, with our own hands, so we would never forget it." I did not understand her, not yet. I would not understand her until 3 days later, when the human ship reappeared in our system, this time trailing wreckage instead of silence, and I finally learned what happens when you make a single mistake that no human will ever let you make twice. For now, all I could do was watch the readout as the Holloway slipped past every line of defense we had, heading toward a sector that had been quietly abandoned 11 years ago, after the kind of incident the Compact prefers not to put in official records. I logged the entry, exactly as I was told. Then I sat back in my chair, the cold ration forgotten beside me, and stared at the empty space where the ship had vanished from my sensors. Something about the calm, deliberate way it had moved unsettled me more than any threat I had ever processed at this station. It had not rushed. It had not hesitated. It had simply gone, the way water goes downhill, the way gravity pulls a stone, with the absolute certainty of something that has done this before and expects to do it again. I told myself it was nothing, a routine patrol, perhaps a supply run to some forgotten outpost. I told myself this for almost 3 full days, until the comm channel lit up again. Not with a single ship this time, but with a request from the Compact Council itself, demanding every officer on Threshold 9 report to an emergency briefing. That was when I understood that whatever the Holloway had gone to do, it had already been done, and the galaxy was about to feel the consequences. I gathered my things slowly, my hands steadier than they had any right to be, and made my way toward the briefing hall, passing colleagues in the corridor who would not quite meet my eyes. Something had happened out past the edge of our patrolled space, something significant enough to pull senior officers out of meetings and junior staff away from their stations without explanation. As I walked, I thought back to Holland's words, a warning, written into our own laws, with our own hands. I had spent 19 years enforcing rules I did not fully understand, accepting the strange exception for humans the way you accept the shape of a coastline, without asking what carved it that way. I was about to find out, and once I did, I would never look at a single, unannounced human ship the same way again. The briefing hall on Threshold 9 was built to hold 200 people comfortably. By the time I arrived, it held closer to 400, packed shoulder to shoulder along every wall, with more crowding the corridor outside. I had never seen the room this full, not even during the joint fleet inspections that usually drew every officer on the station out of simple curiosity. Holland found me near the back and pulled me toward a gap against the wall, where I could at least see the central display. Her expression was unreadable, the calm, practiced stillness of someone who has decided not to let her face say anything until she knows exactly what she is dealing with. "Listen carefully," she said quietly, "and do not ask questions yet. There will be time for that later." The lights dimmed, and a Compact administrator I did not recognize stepped onto the platform at the front of the hall. She was Oseron, her feathered crest pressed flat against her skull in a way that, among her people, signaled distress. She did not waste time with formalities. 3 days ago, she said, we lost contact with Colony Varen, a joint research and mining settlement on the edge of Sector 12, housing just over 2,000 residents from 6 different member species. At 0400 station time, all communication ceased without warning. Automated distress beacons activated 40 minutes later and have continued broadcasting since. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sector 12 was not unfamiliar to me. It bordered the abandoned region the Holloway had vanished into 3 nights before, the same dead zone Holland had refused to let me question her about. The administrator continued, her voice steady despite the crest still pressed flat against her head. Sensor drones dispatched to investigate confirmed the presence of a hostile raiding force, identified through wreckage signatures as remnants of the Karvash Combine, operating well outside their established territory. Their numbers and intentions remain unclear. What is clear is that Colony Varen's defenses were insufficient to repel them, and the colony has had no outgoing communication for over 60 hours. I felt my chest tighten. 60 hours was a long time for any colony to remain silent, especially one under threat. Compact protocol requires a full council vote before any multi-species response fleet can be authorized and deployed, she went on. That vote has been scheduled. However, due to the number of member worlds requiring representation and the procedural requirement for each delegate to review the incident report individually before casting judgment, the earliest possible vote will occur in 11 hours. 11 hours. I did the calculation almost without meaning to. 60 hours of silence already, plus the time needed to assemble and deploy a response fleet after the vote concluded, plus transit time to Sector 12 itself. We were not looking at hours before help arrived. We were looking at days. A representative from the Dravex Trade Council stood near the front, his voice carrying easily across the now silent hall. 2,000 civilians. We cannot simply wait 11 hours to begin discussing whether we are permitted to help them. I understand the urgency, the administrator replied, but the council bylaws are explicit. No joint fleet deployment outside compact-controlled space may proceed without unanimous procedural review. This protects every member species from being committed to conflicts they did not agree to enter. Then amend the bylaws. Amending the bylaws requires a vote as well, she said, and I could hear in her tone that she hated saying it as much as we hated hearing it. One that would take considerably longer than 11 hours to schedule. I stood there in that crowded hall, surrounded by hundreds of officers and administrators who clearly understood, the same way I did, that somewhere out past the edge of charted space, 2,000 people were trapped in the wreckage of their own homes, hoping someone was coming, while we debated the correct procedure for deciding whether to come at all. It is easy, looking back, to feel angry at the council for moving so slowly. I want to be fair to them, though, because I have come to understand something in the years since that night. The compact was built by dozens of species who had spent centuries fighting each other before they ever learned to cooperate. Every rule, every procedural delay, every requirement for unanimous review existed because somewhere in the past, a single species had once committed every other member to a war none of them had agreed to fight. The bureaucracy was not cruelty. It was scar tissue. It existed to prevent exactly the kind of disaster that had once nearly torn the entire alliance apart. But scar tissue does not bend well, and that night, it was about to be tested by something it had never been designed to account for. A side door near the front of the hall opened, and a young compact liaison officer hurried in, datapad in hand, whispering urgently to the administrator on the platform. I watched her crest rise slightly, the Asuran equivalent of a sharply raised eyebrow, before she turned back to the assembled crowd. It appears, she said slowly, that we have received a status update regarding the situation at Colony Varen. The hall went silent again, every officer leaning forward slightly, hungry for any information that might mean the wait was shorter than we feared. A single human vessel, registered as the Halloway, entered Sector 12 airspace approximately 3 days ago, she continued. According to the timestamp on the entry log, this occurred several hours before Colony Varen's communications were lost. I felt Holland go very still beside me. I understood, suddenly, why she had refused to let the ship be intercepted 3 nights earlier. She had known, or at least suspected, exactly where it was going. The Halloway has just transmitted a status report directly to compact relay stations, the administrator said. I am going to read it to you exactly as received. She looked down at her datapad, and for a long moment, the only sound in the hall was the faint hum of the climate systems overhead. Colony Varen secure. Hostile force engaged and neutralized. Civilian casualties, 0. Colony infrastructure damage, moderate, repairable. Request medical and engineering support at earliest convenience. No further assistance required for security purposes. Nobody spoke. I do not think anybody in that hall, myself included, fully believed what we had just heard. 2,000 civilians had been trapped under an active hostile raiding force for 60 hours, and a single ship with a crew of 6 had arrived, somehow ended the threat entirely, and was now simply waiting, almost politely, for the rest of us to bring bandages and spare parts. How, someone finally asked from near the front, does a crew of 6 neutralize an entire raiding force in under 3 hours, without authorization, without backup, and without a single civilian casualty? The administrator looked up from her datapad, and for the first time that evening, I saw something close to a tired, knowing smile cross her face. That, she said, is a question this council has been asking itself for a very long time. The 11-hour vote that followed felt, after that report, almost like a formality. Nobody had the heart to skip, but nobody truly believed mattered anymore. I sat through it anyway, along with most of the station, watching delegate after delegate cast their approval for a relief fleet that everyone in the room now understood was simply going to clean up after a problem that had already been solved. It was during a break in that long, strange vote that Holland finally pulled me aside, into a quiet alcove off the main corridor, away from the crowd still buzzing with disbelief over the report from Varen. "You asked me 3 nights ago why that ship did not need our permission," she said. "I remember. I told you it was a warning. We wrote into our own laws. I want you to understand something before this goes any further. The Karvash Combine raiders, who attacked Varen, were not a small group of opportunists. Sensor data from the drones we sent in initially counted at least 40 armed vessels, with ground forces already deployed inside the colony's perimeter. That is not a target a crew of 6 should have been able to engage, let alone neutralize, in under 3 hours. Then how? I do not fully know," she admitted, and I could hear, beneath her usual composure, something that sounded almost like old, weary respect. "I have served this compact for over 60 years, Vethric. I have seen humans do things that should not have been possible according to every tactical model our combined species have ever built. And every single time, the explanation comes back to the same uncomfortable truth, which is..." She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "They do not wait for permission to save people they care about, and they have never, not once in the history of this alliance, needed our help to make that decision matter." I did not fully understand what she meant, not that night. I understood the words, but not the weight behind them, the way you can hear a warning and still not feel its truth, until you have seen the thing it warns you about with your own eyes. That chance would come sooner than I expected. 3 days after the vote concluded, after the relief fleet had finally departed for Varen carrying medical teams and engineering crews, after the official reports had been filed praising the human crew's actions and the careful, measured language the compact used whenever it did not quite know how to process what had actually happened, a new alert crossed my console. The Halloway was returning to Threshold 9. This time, it was not alone. It was not alone, and it was not unharmed. The Halloway came through the restricted lane trailing a second vessel, larger and badly damaged, locked into a tow configuration that told me, before I even pulled the registry, that it had not survived its encounter with the human ship intact. Scorch marks ran the length of its hull. One of its forward weapon arrays had been sheared off entirely, leaving a jagged stump where a cannon mount used to be. It drifted behind the Halloway like a carcass being dragged home from a hunt. I ran the registry the moment both ships cleared the lane boundary, and the result confirmed what I already suspected. The damaged vessel was a Karvash Combine command cruiser, the kind of ship typically used to coordinate large raiding operations rather than fight on the front lines itself. Capturing or disabling one was rare. Capturing one intact enough to be towed back as evidence was almost unheard of. This time, Holland did not tell me to stand down and avoid contact. Instead, she appeared at my station in person, something she rarely did, and watched the readouts over my shoulder with an intensity I had not seen from her before. "They are bringing it in for processing," she said quietly, almost to herself. "That means they want the compact to see exactly what happened out there." Why would they want that? She did not answer right away. Instead, she opened a secure channel to Station Command and requested immediate access to the Halloway's full combat log from the Varen engagement, citing post-incident review authority. I expected to be told the request would take time to process, the way most things did on Threshold 9. Instead, the data came through within minutes, already declassified, as though the Compact Council itself had been waiting for someone to ask. Holland pulled the footage up on my main display and gestured for me to watch.
"You wanted to understand,"
she said.
"Watch, and you will."
The recording began with the Halloway dropping out of transit directly above Colony Varen, close enough that I could see the colony's domed habitats glowing faintly against the dark surface below, and close enough that the 40-plus Karvash vessels surrounding the colony's perimeter were immediately visible, arranged in a loose blockade formation, designed to prevent any escape or rescue attempt. I expected to see the human ship hesitate, perhaps circle the formation to assess it, the way any sensible commander would before engaging a force that outnumbered them so dramatically. Instead, the Holloway's engines flared, and the ship dove directly toward the center of the blockade without pause. They did not even scan the formation first, I said, almost to myself. They did not need to, Holland replied. Keep watching. What followed was unlike any combat record I had ever reviewed in my career. The Holloway moved through the Karvash formation, not like a warship engaging an enemy fleet, but like something closer to a blade moving through water, finding gaps that should not have existed, striking disabling blows against engine systems and weapon mounts, rather than attempting to destroy ships outright. Within the first 4 minutes of the engagement, 6 Karvash vessels had been rendered immobile, their crews very likely alive but unable to continue fighting or fleeing. I noticed something else as the recording continued, something that unsettled me more than the speed of the engagement itself. The Holloway's weapons fire, when I paused to study it closely, was remarkably precise, almost surgical, targeting specific systems rather than simply overwhelming each enemy vessel with raw firepower. It was the kind of accuracy that spoke not of desperation or improvisation, but of deep, practiced familiarity with exactly how much force was needed to stop a threat, without unnecessary destruction. They are not trying to destroy this fleet, I said slowly, understanding dawning even before Holland confirmed it. No, she agreed. They are trying to end the threat as quickly and as cleanly as possible. There is a difference, and it matters more than you might think. The recording continued, and I watched as the remaining Karvash vessels, realizing their formation had collapsed in a matter of minutes, attempted to regroup and concentrate their fire on the Holloway directly. For the first time in the engagement, the human ship's flight pattern shifted, becoming sharper, more aggressive, weaving between incoming fire with margins so narrow that I found myself holding my breath, despite knowing, from the simple fact that the ship now sat docked at our station, that it had survived. A voice crackled through the recording, the Holloway's communications channel, broadcasting a message to the remaining Karvash vessels. I had not expected audio, and the sound of an actual human voice, calm and unhurried despite the chaos visible on screen, sent a small chill through me. This is the Holloway. You are outmatched. Disengage now, and you will be permitted to withdraw. Continue this engagement, and you will not. The voice belonged to a man, and according to the crew manifest Holland pulled alongside the recording. His name was Daniel Cole, listed as the Holloway's commanding officer. There was no anger in his voice, no triumph, nothing that suggested he was enjoying what he was doing. He spoke the way you might speak to someone making an obviously poor decision, patient but firm, giving them one final chance to reconsider before consequences became unavoidable. The Karvash Combine, to their evident misfortune, chose to continue the engagement. What followed was the most decisive 11 minutes of combat I had ever witnessed in any recording, training simulation, or historical archive. The Holloway's tactics shifted again, this time targeting the largest remaining vessel, the command cruiser now being towed behind it in our own docking bay, with a series of precise strikes against its propulsion and weapons systems. The cruiser was disabled within 90 seconds, its remaining escort vessels scattering in what could only be described as open retreat. By the time the recording ended, the Holloway had disabled or destroyed every hostile vessel in the formation, captured the command cruiser largely intact, and according to the colony's own ground sensors, never allowed a single enemy soldier to breach Varen's perimeter defenses. I sat back from the display, my mind struggling to reconcile what I had just watched with everything I understood about military engagement, fleet tactics, and the basic mathematics of warfare. A crew of 6 had defeated a force more than 40 vessels strong, with 0 civilian casualties, and what appeared to be minimal casualties among the hostile crews themselves, in under 3 hours total. This is not possible, I said finally, not according to any tactical model I have ever studied. It is not possible according to compact tactical models, Holland corrected gently. Humans do not build their doctrine the way we do. Every species in this alliance approaches conflict through careful calculation, weighing risk against reward, casualties against objectives. It is how we have survived this long without destroying ourselves entirely. And humans do not calculate that way? Humans calculate differently, she said. I have read enough of their history, and watched enough of their engagements over the years to understand at least this much. When humans decide that something matters enough to act, they do not measure the cost of acting against the cost of waiting. They simply act, as completely and as quickly as they are able, and worry about the cost afterward. I thought of the 11-hour council vote, the careful procedural review, the unanimous approval required before a single compact vessel could be dispatched to help. I thought of 2,000 civilians who had spent 60 hours trapped and afraid, waiting for help that, had it relied solely on official channels, would not have arrived until long after the situation had already been decided, one way or another. "They did not wait for us," I said quietly. "They never do," Holland replied. "And that, Vethric, is precisely why the rule exists. Not because the Compact decided to grant humans a privilege out of gratitude or favor. Because the Compact learned, through bitter experience, that trying to make humans wait for authorization during a crisis does not stop them from acting. It only delays help that people desperately need, while accomplishing nothing except making humans angry at us for getting in their way." I wanted to ask her more, to understand exactly what experience she meant, what incident in the Compact's history had taught this lesson so thoroughly that it had been written permanently into the deepest layer of our laws. But before I could speak, a new alert crossed my console, quieter than the proximity alarm from days before, but somehow more unsettling. A formal request had been filed for a closed-session debrief between the Halloway's commanding officer and the full Compact Council, scheduled for the following day, with Station Command requesting that select border officers, myself included, attend as observers. Holland read the request over my shoulder and was quiet for a long moment before she spoke again. "You wanted to know why this rule exists," she said. "Tomorrow, you are finally going to hear it explained. Not by someone like me repeating old stories secondhand, but by the people who learned the lesson firsthand, on both sides of it." I did not sleep well that night. I kept replaying the recording in my mind, the calm voice offering one last chance to withdraw, the precise, almost gentle efficiency with which an overwhelming threat had been dismantled in under 3 hours by a crew smaller than my own station's night shift roster. I had spent 19 years believing I understood the shape of power in this galaxy, which species held it, how it was measured, and how it was restrained by careful, mutual agreement. Watching that recording, I understood for the first time that there was an entire category of strength in this alliance, that none of our careful agreements had ever truly restrained at all. We had simply learned, a very long time ago, not to stand in its way. The next morning, as I made my way toward the council chamber for the closed session, I passed the docking bay, where the Halloway sat quietly between routine maintenance crews, its hull still showing faint scorch marks from the battle 3 days before. Through a viewport, I caught a brief glimpse of its crew disembarking, 6 humans in simple uniforms, talking quietly among themselves, looking for all the world like any other small crew returning from a routine patrol, rather than the survivors of an engagement that should not have been survivable. One of them, a woman with short dark hair who I would later learn was named Grace Sullivan, the Halloway's chief engineer, glanced toward the viewport as she passed and offered a brief, tired smile in my direction before continuing on. There was nothing menacing in that smile, nothing that suggested the terrifying efficiency I had just watched in the combat recording. She simply looked like someone who had done a difficult job and was glad it was finally over. It was, I think, that small, ordinary smile that unsettled me more than anything else I had seen so far. The capacity for that kind of overwhelming, decisive strength did not sit behind the eyes of a monster. It sat quietly behind the eyes of someone who had simply decided, without hesitation or doubt, that 2,000 strangers mattered enough to risk everything for, and who would, I suspected, make exactly the same decision again, without a moment's pause, if the situation ever called for it. I reached the council chamber with that thought still settled uneasily in my chest, and took my seat among the other observers, waiting to finally hear, in full, the story behind the rule that had shaped my entire career, without my ever truly understanding why. The council chamber was smaller than the briefing hall, built for serious discussion rather than mass announcement, with seating arranged in a wide circle so that no single delegate sat above another. I found a place near the back beside Holland, along with perhaps 30 other observers from various compact branches, all of us quiet, all of us watching the empty chair at the center of the room where Daniel Cole would soon sit. He arrived a few minutes later, dressed plainly, without the kind of ceremonial uniform I had expected for someone about to address the full council. He looked tired in the ordinary way, the way anyone looks after a long mission, rather than the haunted, hardened way I had half expected from someone capable of what I had witnessed in that combat recording. The presiding delegate, an elder Asuran counselor named Vethra Ilsk, opened the session with brief formalities before turning her attention directly to Cole. "Commander Cole," she said, "the Council extends its gratitude for your actions at Colony Varen. Before we proceed to procedural matters, several of our newer officers have asked, both formally and informally, about the origin of the unauthorized entry clause that permitted your response. We believe it would be valuable, for the benefit of those present, to revisit that history plainly, rather than allow it to remain understood only in fragments and rumor." Cole was quiet for a moment, and I noticed something shift in his expression, a brief tightening around the eyes that suggested this was not a story he enjoyed telling, even after however many years had passed since it began. "I wasn't alive for the incident that started this," he said finally. "Most of us weren't, but it's part of what every human who serves out here learns before they ever sit in a command chair, so I can tell it the way it was taught to me." He paused, glancing briefly toward the archive technician seated near the chamber's main display, who nodded and brought up a file marked with a date that meant nothing to me at the time, though I would never forget it afterward. 43 years ago, Cole began, before humanity held a permanent seat on this council, before most of the protocols you operate under today even existed, there was a joint settlement called Aldrin Reach. Mixed colony, a few thousand residents, mostly human and Drevex families, who had built something together out past the edge of charted territory. It wasn't officially part of compact space yet. Humanity was still what your records call a provisional member back then, still working through the long process of full integration. The archive display behind him shifted, showing a faded image of a modest colony, domes and connecting walkways spread across a rust-colored landscape, ordinary and unremarkable in the way most working colonies are. "A raiding force hit Aldrin Reach without warning," Cole continued. "Different group than the Karvash, long since wiped out by now, but the playbook was the same. Surround the colony, cut communications, take what they wanted, and leave whatever was left behind. The colony's distress beacon went out almost immediately. The nearest human response ship, a small patrol vessel called the Meridian, picked it up within the hour and was ready to move." He paused again, and the room had gone very still, every observer leaning slightly forward, sensing that the story was about to turn somewhere none of us would find comfortable. Except Aldrin Reach sat just inside what was then considered provisional compact territory, he said. Which meant, under the rules at the time, any armed response required prior authorization from the regional council, the same way every response still does for every other species today. The Meridian's captain requested emergency clearance to respond immediately. The request was logged and forwarded for review. "How long?" Holland asked quietly from beside me, though I do not think she expected an answer, since she already seemed to know. Cole heard her anyway, and answered without bitterness, though I could hear the old weight of it, sitting carefully beneath his calm tone. 19 hours, he said. 19 hours for the request to clear procedural review, get assigned a case number, and finally receive a formal authorization, because the council at the time required confirmation from at least 3 separate regional delegates before any armed vessel could cross into provisional territory, even in response to an active distress call. Nobody on that council was cruel. Nobody wanted what happened. They were following rules that had been built, carefully and reasonably, to prevent any single species from dragging the others into a conflict without consent. "What happened to Aldrin Reach?" Vethra Ilsk asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer as well, and was asking only so the rest of the room could hear it spoken aloud. "By the time the Meridian received clearance and reached the colony," Cole said, "the raiders had already taken what they wanted and left. The colony's defenses, what little they had, were gone. Out of just over 3,000 residents, fewer than 400 made it through that night. The Meridian's crew didn't fire a single shot, because there was nothing left to fight by the time they arrived. They spent the next 2 days pulling survivors out of collapsed habitats instead." The chamber was utterly silent, Even the soft hum of the climate systems seemed to fade beneath the weight of what we had just heard. I found myself thinking of the 11-hour vote I had sat through only days before, the careful procedural review that had felt, at the time, like simple caution. I understood now, with a cold, sinking clarity, exactly what that caution had cost once before, and exactly why Holland had refused to let me intercept the Halloway on its way to Varen. I won't pretend humanity took that well, Cole continued after a long moment. There was a lot of anger, directed at the council, at the regional delegates who'd followed procedure exactly as written, at the whole system that had let 3,000 people wait 19 hours for permission to be saved. Some of that anger was fair. Some of it wasn't, because the people who made that decision weren't villains. They were following rules built with good intentions, the same way most disasters happen, one reasonable decision at a time, until they add up to something nobody intended. What changed? I found myself asking before I had fully decided to speak, my voice carrying further in the silent chamber than I expected. Several council members glanced toward me, and I felt my face heat slightly, but Cole's expression remained patient, almost grateful for the question. What changed, he said, is that humanity made a decision, and we made it clearly, and we made it permanent. We told the council that we would remain part of this alliance, that we believed in what the compact was trying to build, but that we would never again allow procedural review to stand between a human crew and people who needed help. Full stop. No exceptions, regardless of borders or authorization status. We said it plainly. If you try to make us wait again, we will not wait. We will act, and we will deal with whatever consequences follow afterward, because we have already seen what waiting costs, and we have decided that cost is not one we are willing to pay a second time. The council pushed back, I assume, Holland said. For a while, Cole admitted, there were debates that lasted months, delegates arguing that an exception for one species would set an impossible precedent, that it would create resentment among other member worlds, who would feel humanity was being granted special status without earning it through the same procedural patience everyone else accepted. Those were fair concerns. I won't pretend they weren't. Then how was it resolved? Vethra Ilsk asked, though again, the question felt more like an invitation for the room to hear the answer than genuine uncertainty on her part. It wasn't resolved through debate, Cole said. It was resolved through demonstration. Over the following 2 years, there were 3 more incidents, smaller than Aldrin Reach, where human vessels acted without waiting for clearance, the same way the Meridian had tried and failed to do. Every single time, the outcome was the same. Lives saved that procedural review would have cost. No unauthorized conflicts created with other species. No precedent abused. Just help, arriving exactly when it was needed, without delay, every time. He paused, glancing briefly around the chamber, meeting the eyes of several delegates who, I suspected, had been present, in one role or another, for at least part of that long, difficult history. Eventually, he continued, the council stopped arguing about precedent and started looking at outcomes instead. Humanity wasn't asking for the right to start conflicts without authorization. We were asking for the right to end them, the moment we became aware they existed, without waiting for permission that had already proven, at Aldrin Reach, that it could arrive too late to matter. The unauthorized entry clause was written into compact law not as a gift to humanity, but as an acknowledgement of something the Council had already learned through hard experience. You cannot legislate away a species' willingness to act when people are in danger. You can only decide whether you are going to slow that response down through bureaucracy or get out of the way and let it work. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle into place that had been unsettled in me since the night the Halloway first crossed our restricted lane without so much as a courtesy ping. So the rule exists, I said slowly, not because the Compact trusts humanity more than any other species. It exists because the Compact learned that trying to restrain humanity during a crisis doesn't actually stop anything. It only adds a delay that costs lives, while accomplishing nothing except making humans angry at a system that failed the people it was supposed to protect. Cole looked at me directly for the first time since the session began, and something in his expression softened slightly, the tired patience of someone who has had to explain this same hard lesson many times before, to many different officers across many different years. That's about the size of it, he said. We're not asking the compact to trust us blindly. We've earned the right to act without waiting, the same way anyone earns trust, by demonstrating, over and over, that we use it carefully, and that the alternative, waiting for us not to use it, costs more than anyone should ever have to pay. The session continued for some time after that, moving into procedural matters regarding the captured Karvash command cruiser and the ongoing relief effort at Colony Varen, but I found myself only half listening, my mind still caught on the image of Aldrin Reach, 3,000 residents in 19 hours, and the quiet, unshakable resolve that incident had apparently carved into an entire species' approach to every crisis that followed it. When the session finally adjourned, I lingered near the back of the chamber, watching the delegates and observers file out, until only Holland and I remained, along with Cole, who was gathering a small data case from the table at the center of the room. He noticed us watching and offered a brief, tired nod in our direction before speaking. "First time hearing that story all the way through?" he asked, looking at me specifically. "Yes," I admitted. I had heard fragments. I did not understand the full weight of it until now. "Most people don't, until they have to," he said, not unkindly. "It's not a story we tell because we're proud of it. We tell it because we never want anyone, human or otherwise, to forget what waiting cost the first time, so nobody ever has to learn that lesson twice." He left the chamber a moment later, and I stood there beside Holland in the quiet, emptying room, finally understanding, fully and completely, the answer to the question that had haunted me since the night a single human ship crossed our border, without permission and without apology. The rule was never a privilege. It was a promise, written into law after the worst possible price had already been paid, to learn why it mattered, and carried forward ever since by a species that had decided, once and permanently, that they would never again let careful procedure stand between themselves and someone who needed help. 6 weeks passed before I understood the rest of what Daniel Cole had tried to teach me that day, and it took a crisis of my own to finish the lesson properly. In the time after the closed session, something in me had quietly shifted, the way a single fact, once fully understood, can rearrange everything you thought you knew around it. I no longer looked at the unauthorized entry clause the way I once had, as a strange exception carved into our rulebook for reasons nobody bothered to explain. I understood now that it had been carved there the way a scar is carved into skin, permanent, deliberate, and earned through a kind of pain the compact never wanted to feel twice. I began reading more, in the quiet hours between shifts, pulling old archive records about Aldrin Reach and the years that followed it. I learned that the survivors who had been pulled from the wreckage that night, the 400 who made it through, had gone on to become some of the strongest advocates for the very alliance that had nearly failed them, not out of bitterness, but because they understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly what kind of cooperation was worth building and what kind of caution was worth discarding. I learned that the unauthorized entry clause had since been quietly studied by other compact branches, considered as a model for emergency response reform, though none had yet found a way to grant it to species that did not share humanity's particular willingness to bear the consequences of acting first and explaining afterward. I also began noticing something I had never paid attention to before, something Holland pointed out to me one evening as we reviewed routine traffic logs together near the end of a long shift. "You called them the galaxy's nightmare once," she said, not looking up from her console. "Back when you were still angry about the exemption." I winced slightly at the memory. I had said exactly that, in frustration, during one of my early complaints about the rule, before I understood what stood behind it. "I remember," I admitted. "I am not proud of it." "You should not be ashamed of it either," she said. "It is not an uncommon phrase. Half the officers on this station have used some version of it at one point or another. I used it myself, many years ago, before I understood what it actually meant." "And what does it mean?" I asked, "now that you do understand it?" She considered the question for a long moment, the way she always did, before giving an answer she actually believed in, rather than simply the answer that was easiest to give. "It means humans are the one variable nobody in this galaxy can predict or control," she said finally. "Every other species, ourselves included, can be reasoned with through process. Show us a procedure, a precedent, a careful argument about risk and consequence, and we will follow it. because that is how we have learned to survive among each other without destroying ourselves. Humans can be reasoned with too, in most matters. But the moment someone they care about is in danger, that capacity for careful calculation simply stops mattering to them. They do not weigh the cost of acting against the cost of waiting. They act, completely and immediately, and they sort out the consequences afterward, the same way Commander Cole described. That sounds like recklessness, I said, though I no longer fully believed it as I said it. It would be, if it were not so consistently effective, Holland replied. That is the part that unsettles every species in this alliance, myself included, if I am honest. It is not that humans act without thinking. It is that they think very quickly, and very clearly, and arrive at conclusions the rest of us would need committees and careful review to reach, all in the time it takes the rest of us to simply begin discussing whether action is warranted at all. Nobody can predict what a human crew will do when something they value is threatened, because the only variable that actually matters to them in that moment is whether they believe they can help, not whether procedure permits it. I thought of the Holloway diving directly into the center of a 40-vessel blockade without hesitation, of Daniel Cole's calm voice offering the Karvash raiders one final chance to withdraw before consequences became unavoidable, of Grace Sullivan's tired, ordinary smile as she walked past the viewport where I stood watching her, looking for all the world like someone who had simply finished an honest day's work rather than the survivor of an engagement that should not have been survivable. It is not a nightmare because they are monsters, I said slowly, working the thought out loud as it formed. It is a nightmare because they cannot be stopped, delayed, or predicted by anyone who might wish them harm, and because no enemy, anywhere in this galaxy, can ever be certain how much time they actually have before a human crew decides to simply stop waiting and act. Now you understand, Holland said, and there was something almost like quiet pride in her voice, the kind a teacher feels when a difficult lesson finally lands the way it was always meant to. The true test of that understanding came not long after, during a shift that began, much like the night the Holloway first crossed our border, with an alarm I was not prepared for. A transport convoy carrying refugees from a destabilized mining colony had been ambushed just inside our patrol boundary. 3 civilian vessels caught in open space with minimal defenses, their distress beacon activating less than 2 minutes before their primary communications array was disabled entirely. I was the senior officer on duty that night, Holland having taken a rare period of rest after weeks of continuous shifts, which meant the decision, for the first time in my career, was entirely mine to make. Compact protocol was clear, the same careful, reasonable protocol that had governed every decision I had ever made at this post. Confirm the threat through secondary sensors, log the incident, route the report through the standard chain of command for authorization before dispatching any armed response. A process that, even moving as quickly as possible, would take no less than 40 minutes to complete. I sat there for perhaps 3 full seconds, watching the distress beacon flicker on my console. 3 civilian vessels and an unknown number of hostile ships closing in around them, and I thought of Aldrin Reach, and 19 hours, and 400 survivors out of 3,000. I did not wait 40 minutes. I dispatched the nearest available response vessel immediately, a small compact patrol craft on routine rotation, less than 6 minutes from the convoy's position, authorizing the deployment under emergency discretionary protocol, before the formal report had even finished routing through the chain of command. I knew, even as I did it, that I would likely face questions afterward about bypassing standard procedure, about the risk of committing a vessel to an engagement before full authorization had been confirmed. I made the decision anyway, because I finally understood, in a way I never had before that night, that the cost of waiting was not an abstract concern, written into old archive records about a colony I had never visited. It was a real and immediate wait, sitting on the other end of every minute that passed, while 3 civilian vessels waited for someone, anyone, to decide that they mattered enough to act for, without first confirming, through careful and reasonable procedure, that acting was permitted. The patrol vessel reached the convoy in under 5 minutes. The hostile force, smaller than initially feared, withdrew the moment armed support arrived, recognizing correctly that their advantage had evaporated. All 3 civilian vessels and every refugee aboard them reached Threshold 9 safely, less than 2 hours later. I was questioned about the decision afterward, exactly as I expected. Station Command reviewed the incident carefully, weighing whether my choice to bypass standard authorization procedure had been justified or simply reckless. In the end, the review concluded that my judgment had been sound, that the circumstances warranted discretionary action, and that no harm had come from the deviation. I do not think the outcome would have changed my decision either way, looking back. I had simply understood, finally, and completely, the same lesson Daniel Cole had carried with him into that quiet council chamber weeks before. Some costs are not worth weighing carefully against the comfort of careful procedure. Some decisions cannot wait for permission without losing the only thing that ever made them worth making at all. I think of that night often now, alongside everything I learned about Aldrin Reach and Colony Varen, and the small, unremarkable crew of the Halloway who arrived without authorization and left behind a lesson that reshaped how I understood every rule I had ever enforced at this station. I no longer think of the unauthorized entry clause as a strange exception, or even as a privilege earned through demonstration, though both of those things remain true. I think of it now as something closer to a promise, made once by an entire species, and kept consistently enough, across enough years and enough crises, that the rest of the galaxy finally stopped questioning it and simply learned to trust it instead. I never did learn what became of the survivors from Aldrin Reach in the decades since that first terrible night, though I suspect, given everything I have since learned about humanity's particular stubbornness when it comes to remembering hard lessons, that more than a few of them went on to serve aboard ships very much like the Halloway, carrying forward the same simple, unshakable certainty that had once been denied them when they needed it most. I still serve at Threshold 9. I still process every authorization request that crosses my console, still hold every species in this alliance to the same careful, reasonable standard the Compact has built over centuries of hard-won cooperation. But when a human vessel crosses my restricted lane now, without request, without hesitation, without so much as a courtesy ping to announce its arrival, I no longer reach for the intercept protocol out of habit or frustration. I simply log the entry, exactly as I am required to, and I think, quietly and without bitterness, of everything that single uncrossed border once cost, and everything it has saved since the day the Compact finally learned to step aside and let it stand open. Because that, in the end, is the answer to the question that brought me here. Humans are not permitted to enter without authorization because the galaxy granted them some special favor, or because the Compact trusts them more than any other species in this alliance. They are permitted because we learned, once, through a price no one should ever have to pay twice, that trying to make them wait does not stop them from acting. It only ensures that whatever help finally arrives too late to matter. So we stopped trying. We opened the border, and we kept it open, and somewhere out past the edge of charted space, a small gray ship with a crew of 6 continues doing exactly what it has always done, arriving exactly when it is needed, without asking anyone first, because it has already decided, long before it ever reaches the people who need it, that some decisions are not meant to wait for permission at all,